In Washington, most hearings fade into obscurity, hours of scripted questions, rehearsed answers, and political theater. But every so often, a moment happens that cuts through the noise and forces the nation to stop and listen. That's exactly what unfolded when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped into a packed committee room to question Judge Amul Thapur, a man groomed for higher office by the conservative legal establishment. What started as a routine confirmation hearing exploded into a national reckoning on wealth, privilege, and the meaning of justice in America. By the end of the day, a rising judge's career lay in ruins, a prisoner's handwritten letter had become a rallying cry, and a young congresswoman emerged as the unexpected face of a new movement. This is the story of how a single confrontation shook the foundations of the American legal system, and why its impact is still being felt today. The drama erupted in a tense congressional hearing room, where Judge Amul Thapur, a respected federal judge and candidate for higher office, faced questioning that would shake the establishment. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, armed with documents and an unyielding sense of justice, confronted him directly. "Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" She exposed the stark disparity between two nearly identical cases: Sarah Henderson, a poor black woman sentenced harshly, and Michael Brennan III, a wealthy white man who walked away with probation, making it painfully clear that America's justice system had two playbooks, one for the wealthy, one for the poor. As Crockett read aloud Henderson's heartbreaking letter asking if her children would even remember her after prison, the room fell silent, and Thapur sat frozen before offering only a weak defense. Crockett's cutting reply: "No, Judge. You followed two different sets of guidelines. That's not justice. That's discrimination," with a gavel, reverberated far beyond the chamber. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread across social media, igniting hashtags like #SarahHendersonMatters and #EqualJustice. Millions shared the video of Crockett's trembling voice reading Sarah's letter, calling it one of the most powerful congressional moments since Watergate. Activists seized on Thapur's silence as proof the system could not defend its inequities, while ordinary Americans poured out their own stories of injustice: brothers imprisoned while wealthy peers walked free, mothers mourning sons lost to bias, public defenders admitting impossible caseloads. By nightfall, Crockett's takedown had grown into a movement, hailed by civil rights leaders as justice finding its voice, and one haunting question echoed across the nation: how many Sarah Hendersons are there in America? Judge Thapur's allies scrambled to contain the fallout, but their defenses collapsed almost immediately. Conservative legal groups that had spent months grooming his nomination rushed out statements insisting that individual cases taken out of context should not overshadow a record of judicial excellence, yet Crockett had already revealed a pattern stretching across his career. Wealthy defendants consistently received leniency, while poor defendants were crushed by severe sentences. Reporters, scholars, and advocacy groups pored over his record, unearthing more examples, while think tanks like the Heritage Foundation tried to frame the confrontation as a political ambush. But the disparities were too stark to dismiss. Even conservative commentators admitted on live television, "You don't need to be a Democrat to see what happened here." The law was applied differently depending on money. When moderate Republicans began to retreat, Senator Patricia Williams calling for a serious review of sentencing disparities, followed within a day by 3 GOP senators pledging to vote against Thapur, the nomination, once seen as inevitable, collapsed into a sinking ship. Behind closed doors, conservative strategists fumed. Months of lobbying and political capital had been undone in a single afternoon by Crockett's precision and fearlessness. What began as a judicial hearing transformed her into a national figure overnight. No longer just a congresswoman from Texas, she was hailed as the new face of criminal justice reform. Former President Obama's senior advisor tweeted that Crockett had shown America what accountability looks like. Cable networks praised her preparation, while even conservative outlets, though criticizing her tone, admitted her evidence was devastating. Her background as a public defender gave her unmatched credibility. She spoke plainly, in human terms that resonated far beyond Washington. Political doors flew open. She was invited onto the Democratic leadership's messaging team, asked to lead a new judicial reform working group, and courted by law schools for guest lectures. Civil rights groups declared her a champion, and young lawyers flooded her office to join her mission. As one commentator put it, Crockett didn't just stop a judge, she started a movement. Her rise was bigger than politics. She had tapped into a deep national hunger for fairness in a justice system millions no longer trusted. In the days following the hearing, one name echoed across America: Sarah Henderson. Her letter, read aloud by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, became the emotional centerpiece of the scandal, shifting the outrage from Judge Thapur to the heartbreaking injustice Sarah endured. Crowdfunding campaigns raised over $200,000 for her children within a week, while civil rights groups demanded her release and the Legal Aid Society of Texas offered to handle her appeal pro bono. Investigations into her case revealed a devastating imbalance. Her overburdened public defender had spent just 12 minutes with her before sentencing, presented no mitigating evidence, called no witnesses, and offered no rehabilitation plan. By contrast, Michael Brennan III, the wealthy defendant Crockett had used as a comparison, had a high-powered attorney who dedicated over 40 hours, hired investigators, consulted specialists, and presented a polished rehabilitation plan that spared him prison. Sarah's plight became a national symbol of systemic injustice, igniting protests, petitions, and op-eds while legal clinics nationwide uncovered similar cases. Her quiet letter from prison had become a rallying cry for reform. Crockett's confrontation had not only sunk Thapur's nomination but cracked open the doors of America's legal system. Advocacy groups seized the moment. The ACLU released a damning report proving sentencing disparities tied to wealth were widespread, while the Department of Justice announced an unprecedented nationwide review of sentencing patterns. Journalists uncovered similar injustices in Chicago, Atlanta, and beyond, prompting new hearings and appeals. Thapur himself, desperate to salvage credibility, announced courtroom reforms such as mandatory documentation of sentencing factors and statistical reviews of his rulings, while other judges quietly began auditing their own records. Law schools started teaching Crockett's questioning as a model for holding power accountable, and the American Bar Association launched campaigns to expand funding for public defenders and require more pro bono work from private attorneys. What had begun as a fiery exchange in a hearing room had grown into a movement reshaping the very culture of American law. Washington was rattled. For Republicans, Judge Thapur's collapse wasn't just a failed nomination, it was a strategic disaster. They had spent months elevating him as a model conservative jurist, only to watch his record dismantled in real time on national television. Senate Majority Leader Johnson tried to project calm, insisting they would carefully review all the information presented, but his cautious tone only confirmed what was obvious: Thapur's nomination was dead. Moderate Republicans, terrified of being linked to glaring sentencing disparities, quickly broke ranks. Within 48 hours, 3 GOP senators publicly opposed his promotion. The defection stunned conservative legal groups like the Federalist Society, who realized that future nominees would face far tougher scrutiny. Democrats, meanwhile, were electrified. Leaders who once dismissed Jasmine Crockett's aggressive style now embraced her as a national asset, inviting her into high-level strategy meetings and naming her to lead a new working group on judicial reform. Media narratives shifted too. Outlets that usually labeled progressives as radicals praised Crockett's command of facts, while even some conservative commentators admitted she had exposed real problems in the system. Outside Washington, the public was just as engaged. Polls showed overwhelming bipartisan support for reform, with 78% of Americans, and even 63% of conservatives, backing equal treatment in sentencing regardless of wealth. In a matter of days, Crockett had transformed one hearing into a nationwide reckoning over justice itself. Her fiery takedown also ignited something far beyond Congress. It lit a fire in a generation of young lawyers and activists. Law schools reported surges in interest in public defense programs. At her alma mater, the University of Texas, applications to the criminal defense track tripled in a single semester. Professors began teaching her hearing as a case study in fact-based advocacy, noting, Crockett didn't use cheap gotcha lines, she built her case piece by piece until the judge had no escape. Inspired, young attorneys reconsidered lucrative corporate careers, with legal aid offices and public defender programs flooded with applications. Even private law firm associates began requesting transfers to pro bono departments or negotiating time for public interest cases. Civil rights groups saw donations spike, while the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers reported a 40% increase in fellowship applications. Activists dubbed it the Crockett effect. And it wasn't just lawyers, students, organizers, and ordinary citizens alike felt galvanized by her courage. As one law student put it, Crockett showed us that the law isn't just about books and cases. It's about people, and whether they're treated with dignity or discarded. Her performance had transformed public defense from an underfunded backwater into a meaningful, even prestigious calling. The ripple effects were unmistakable. Crockett hadn't just confronted a judge, she had inspired an entire movement of advocates ready to fight the same battle. For Judge Amul Thapur, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Just 2 days after the hearing, he withdrew his nomination for promotion, citing personal reasons. Though everyone knew the truth, Jasmine Crockett had ended his chances. His statement, delivered through an attorney, was short and defensive, claiming he remained committed to fair and impartial justice, but offering no acknowledgement of the disparities Crockett had exposed. Behind the scenes, conservative legal circles were furious. Groups like the Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation, who had invested enormous political capital in grooming Thapur, were humiliated and forced to admit their vetting process had failed. For the first time in decades, conservative legal strategists realized judicial philosophy alone wasn't enough. Nominees would now be judged on their actual sentencing records. Inside the judiciary, ripple effects spread quickly. Thapur himself introduced new courtroom protocols, requiring detailed documentation of sentencing considerations and mandatory statistical reviews of rulings, in an effort to salvage his reputation. Other judges, fearful of exposure, quietly began auditing their own decisions, while judicial training programs expanded to include sentencing equity and ethics. Colleagues who once praised Thapur distanced themselves, with several withdrawing recommendations after admitting they hadn't grasped the extent of his disparities. Conservative insiders acknowledged the painful truth. Crockett hadn't just dismantled Thapur, she had forced an entire movement to retreat and rethink. What began as one tense exchange in a hearing room soon entered history as a watershed moment for American justice. For years, activists had warned of a two-tier legal system, one for the wealthy, another for the poor, but those warnings rarely broke through. Crockett changed that. With carefully chosen facts and Sarah Henderson's haunting letter, she gave injustice a face, a name, and a story no one could ignore. Politically, the effects were immediate. Democrats embraced judicial reform as a central platform, pushing for stronger public defender funding, mandatory sentencing reviews, and stricter oversight of judges. Republicans, stung by Thapur's implosion, quietly recalibrated, wary of nominating judges with questionable sentencing histories. But beyond politics, the cultural impact was even greater. Millions of Americans, many who had never followed a judicial hearing before, suddenly saw how deeply courtroom decisions could shape lives. Crockett's exchange trended online for weeks, replayed on late-night shows, and entered classrooms as a case study in advocacy. Historians would later describe it as the spark that ignited a decade of criminal justice reforms, expanded funding for defense, normalized sentencing transparency, and the birth of the so-called Crockett hearings, shorthand for grilling nominees with empathy and precision. Most of all, it proved something rare in modern politics, that one person, armed with courage and preparation, could shift the course of a nation. As the New York Times put it, Crockett didn't just confront a judge. She confronted a system, and won. Her legacy was not only the fall of Judge Thapur but the rise of a new expectation in American justice: fairness for everyone.